Is there anybody there? Yes, we're all still here, in Kansas, in London, in Leeds, and in all the other city regions of the world. But that film presupposed that one day soon we might not still be here, or if we were, that we wouldn't be all that lucky to be alive. In a moment after the break, we'll be discussing that film with Michael Heseltine, the Defense Secretary, with CND and others, including a studio audience, not all that different perhaps from those fictional citizens of Lawrence near Kansas City. If you were affected by that film, join us after the break.
The search for a new color television is over. Sanyo have created a complete range for those with a keen eye for vision and a fine ear for sound, built to the same high standards as Sanyo's world-famous video equipment, with that same careful attention paid to contemporary styling, picture quality, and value for money. If you're searching for color television, see Sanyo, then decide.
Hello, my name is Ralph Cohen, Managing Director of Philips Major Appliances here in Halifax. We believe in giving you the machines you want. Easy to use, well-made, reliable, energy-saving machines, like these. Machines of this caliber deserve an outstanding washing powder. New System Personal Automatic is so good on today's wash, it's the only powder that we recommend, and the only packet we put in our machines.
The new Patco Workbench. It's sensational at only $29.95. Ideal for the garage, garden shed or workroom. The Patco Workbench. It's easy to assemble. You'll love a Patco Workbench, only $29.95. It's available in East Anglia at branches of Texas.
For sore throat, the lozenge that does so much tastes so good. Delicious Mac blackcurrant flavor makes relief taste terrific.
Get the Pampers, darling.
Why do we use Pampers all the time? Susan's mummy uses proper nappies.
And so did I. But terry nappies are cloth, and when cloth gets wet, it stays wet. Pampers are different.
How?
They have a special liner that lets the wetness soak into the padding, but hates letting it back to wet a baby's skin.
A terry and a Pampers are made equally wet. The blotter shows how much less of that wetness soaks back on Pampers.
So why didn't I have Pampers when I was a baby?
You would have done if they'd been around then.
Pampers protect like terries never could.
Sit up straight, Susie. Today I'll show you how to make bubbles. First, you need water. Then, what's next?
A squeeze of terry liquid.
Write that down, class.
And look, lovely bubbles.
Then you put your hands in.
Yes, I like these gentle bubbles. They help keep my hands as soft as Susie's.
What else do gentle bubbles do?
They make this dirty milk tub sparkling clean.
Now, children, today's lesson's about gentle bubbles. And soft hands, Mummy.
Now hands that do dishes can feel soft as your face with mild green fairy liquid.
Just want to start.
Do you mind if I ask a personal question?
No. What is it?
In my heart, I have
Share the fantasy. Chanel number 5.
We have here in a studio in Leeds a selected audience, some of whose views we know and some of whose we don't know. The latter being perhaps counterparts in Britain of those citizens of the town near Kansas City whose terrible fictional experience we've just been watching in that film the day after. The purpose of our discussion tonight, I hope, is to try to move thoughtfully towards some certainty that that terrible experience in the film will always remain fictional for everyone. In a studio in London, we have Mr. Michael Heseltine, the Secretary of State for Defence, also Mr. Dennis Healey, a former Labour Secretary of State for Defence, and Dr. David Owen, leader of the Social Democratic Party and former Foreign Secretary.
We'll also be talking to other experts and officials on both sides of the Atlantic, including Joan Ruddock from CND and the former American Secretary of Defence, Robert McNamara. But to begin, the present British Defence Secretary.
Secretary of State, you've criticised this film as carrying a message of ultimate failure. But its message is not that. It's a message that there could be ultimate failure of the deterrent to deter. Surely it's not sadly unbalanced, as you've called it, to suggest that.
Well, obviously, the events it depicts are deeply shocking, and it has a horrifying impact on one. And I think the chilling words at the end, "Is there nobody there?" leave a sort of impact of hopelessness. But the fact is that we're all there. And after decades, when the former ministers and myself who are on this program have had to live with these horrifying decisions, we have actually kept the peace in Western Europe for an unprecedented period in contemporary history.
But the point the film is making is that might not continue to be so in the future. It just says it might not.
Yes, I know that.
Well, are you saying that's unreasonable?
What I find disturbing about the film, in addition, of course, to the horrific portrayal of the events that I willingly accept, is that it rewrites history. And time and again...
In what way? It's about the future.
If I can give you some examples, which I think your audience and the wider viewing audience will remember. We went through the tensions of Berlin. We had the statement in the film about it's just like the Cuban Missile Crisis all over again. We had the riots in East Germany. It didn't mention riots in Central Europe. But all of these things we've lived through in a nuclear age. And the chilling thing about the power of nuclear weapons is that there's no secret about it. Everybody knows about the scale of horrendous potential damage in those weapons. But precisely because we all do know, we have actually lived at peace, because everybody understands, both in the Soviet Union and in the NATO alliance, that there could never be a winner in any war of that sort.
Exactly. That's why it's so appalling to think that there might be such a war. Can you really say you have the unshakable conviction that the deterrent will always continue to deter as it's deterred, as you've just said, for the last 40 years?
I believe that that is the case. And I think that it is precisely because we all know of the horrendous capabilities that your film has shown that that deterrent will work. Because nobody who's in a position to have any influence at all, and I say this of those who run the Soviet Union just as much as those who run the NATO alliance, nobody could countenance the use of those weapons. And so whenever the sort of examples that the films shows to indicate how it could happen confront us, actually sanity has prevailed. And that is the message that is missing from this film.
The message that we've had sanity so far, but can you honestly, looking at human history, guarantee that sane, reasonable people will continue to handle this weapon in the future? Are there not real risks involved?
But
will it never fail, or might it never fail?
Looking at history, nobody has ever had weapons of this sort before. We've certainly had horror capability before. I mean, many of us lived through the first films of the appalling consequences of Belsen. We know that 20 million people died in the Soviet Union in the last war. We remember the saturation bombing. We've seen horror before, but we've never had within human capability the absolute horror situation of nuclear power.
But surely, therefore, all the more reason to consider that it might be
This is the difference that has actually brought about this capacity of the two sides, if you like, Warsaw Pact, Soviet Union on the one hand, NATO on the other, whenever faced with the very dangerous situations that in another generation could have escalated to war, has actually produced a situation where people have backed off. And I believe that it is absolutely critical that we remember that, because the fear that I have, if we don't, is that we will change the defense policies that actually have kept that peace.
Mr. Heseltine, may I put this to you?
Certainly.
All that film was doing, at the most, was to question the success of our defence policies. You are implying, almost, that we have no right to question the defence policies of today.
Well, I don't think that that's compatible with the advice that I gave, that I thought people should watch this film. Because, you see, I think that that film actually is the most powerful argument for our defence policies.
And are you glad it was made?
Well, I believe in the widest possible debate in a democracy. I can't help but contrast the fact that that film will never be seen behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union won't let their people see that film.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid I can't help contrasting your interview with us, for which I thank you very much, with the fact that you, in fact, would not take part in the subsequent debate.
Well, can I just answer that point? Because that is a very important point. I think that that film has a message of propaganda. And I think it is critically important, therefore, that I should have the chance to answer it. And I do not believe that I would be doing that adequately if I was set in a context where I was being balanced within itself. I wanted, and I believe rightly, to balance the film.
But I must just repeat the point. It is surely very authoritarian to suggest that it is propaganda if one questions defence policy and suggests that the present defence policy might not succeed.
I don't believe it is authoritarian. When I was faced with the decision that you put to me, do I think people should watch the film, I said I thought they should. Now that is encouraging debate, but when the film is shown, I believe that there should be a real debate, and that is why I asked for the opportunity to comment upon it, so there would be a balance to the discussion. If I hadn't had such a chance, I believe there would have been an unbalanced position, and I think that that would be wrong and not in the highest keepings of the democratic tradition. And so I thank you for giving me the opportunity to respond.
If somebody made a film about an international crisis in which the deterrent was a success and did work, would that be unbalanced?
But constantly people are, and constantly there are the opportunities to discuss these matters.
But you don't say they're unbalanced.
If somebody wanted at a senior level in a government to ask for the opportunity to comment, you'd have to take a decision as to whether or not you should allow them. But the important thing is that up to now in this country, broadly, there has been a consensus of views about the defence policies that we have pursued. If there had not been such a consensus and such a film had been made in the hypothetical situation you put to me, I dare say people would have asked to comment on it, and I dare say you would have given them the opportunity, and you would have been right to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Heseltine.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Dennis Healy, who is also in London, what was your reaction to that film, and do you agree with Mr. Heseltine about it?
I don't agree with Mr. Heseltine, but I think the film and the issues it is concerned with are far more important than individuals. I think my first reaction, like almost everybody who watched it, was emotional. Horror, because it shows that a nuclear war would produce a situation which was the abomination of desolation and the four horsemen of the apocalypse riding over a desert. And you must recognize that the film does not represent the full horror of the reality, because scientists now agree that if there were a nuclear exchange on that scale, then smoke and radioactive dust would form a cloud which would blot out the sun, and the whole of Europe, Asia, and the United States and Canada would suffer from icy night for 12 whole months.
So in a way, the film didn't go far enough.
It didn't really, and I think the other emotion one must feel is anger at governments which deliberately misrepresent the truth. Mr. Heseltine, for example, said that nobody claims you can win a nuclear war, but the fact is that President Reagan's National Security Council has issued a defense directive, number 13, I think it is, which says that the purpose of American policy is to prevail, that's to say to win, in a protracted nuclear war. His Undersecretary for Defense responsible for nuclear matters said that if we have enough shovels, everyone will get through. His Civil Defense Organization issued a booklet saying that radiation is rather like sunlight.
Mr. Healy, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we will be coming on to those matters in the second half of the programme, when you will have an opportunity to intervene, of course, from London. Could I just for the moment ask Dr. Owen what he thought of the film?
Well, I think my first reaction was a sort of sense of numbing and a feeling that the whole thing is one in which one wants perhaps a pause. I'm not sure I want a political argument now. I want cool and fairly rational thought about where we are to go next. I think the film is reasonably fair and accurate. I don't actually agree with Michael that it's propaganda. I think the crucial question that we have to ask ourselves is the events that led up to it, are they realistic? Unfortunately, they are. I personally think it concentrates on that most crucial thing, which is battlefield nuclear weapons. And I think this is what we've ignored. We've talked about strategic weapons, we've talked about Pershing crews, we've not talked about tactical nuclear weapons, which is the thing that triggered this war. And the 3 nuclear airbursts over the advancing Russian forces when they'd made a conventional breakthrough in Europe is part of the strategy of both the Warsaw Pact and of NATO. I think it's the wrong strategy, and I think therefore it's very important that we'll talk about that. And I think that film is true and honest. It gives us a fairly accurate interpretation.
We will indeed be talking about that, Doctor, and thank you, and Mr. Healy and Mr. Heseltine. Now, let's have some words from our audience here, and Jane Walmsley.
Well, as we've said, there are people here tonight with varying shades of opinion. Perhaps the one thing we have in common is a very clear idea of what's at stake. So your reactions, please, to the aftermath of nuclear war as seen in that film. If I can start with the lady in the second row here with the checked shirt.
Yes, I am a parent, a mother of a small child, and of course I felt absolutely desperate and very saddened about it. It just doesn't bear thinking about. One point I'd like to make is that it shows the hopelessness of civil defence plans, and certainly for people with small children.
Right, we'll be moving on to that point later. Can I take the gentleman sitting about 4 rows back there with the dark blue jacket on? Did you feel any more encouraged by the film than anybody else?
I didn't think it went far enough, really.
In what way?
I think it should have been more stronger than what it was.
Strong, that wasn't bad enough, that the reality would be worse.
Exactly.
All right, let's try. When the film was shown in America, there was a great deal of discussion about whether school children ought to be allowed to see it. We have some fifth formers from Leicester here tonight. Can I take the fellow with the burgundy scarf around his neck about 4 rows back there? What did you think? Are you glad you're here?
Yeah, I'm glad actually that people like us were having an opportunity to see it, because I don't feel that enough is shown about the horrors of nuclear war to people, well, everyone, not just people of our age. Yeah, and in a way, I'm quite glad that it's shown later because it's a very horrible film.
Right, so you're glad you weren't protected. We have a lady here called Mrs. Bowers, Mrs. Daphne Bowers, the lady in the black cardigan. You happen to have a bunker at the bottom of your garden, Mrs. Bowers.
That's right.
Why?
Well, as the situation is, we think we needed it.
What would you do if the moment came and the missiles were on their way?
Well, if my children weren't there, I wouldn't want to be there. My children are my life. I brought them into the world to live, not to die.
So if you were separated from your children at the moment of impact, you would do what?
I'd stay out. I don't want to live if my children can't live.
And there we'll have to leave it for a moment. There will be more from the audience later in the program.
You'll remember that in the day after, the Russians had launched 300 missiles at military and industrial targets all over America. Now, all the evidence suggests that a similar attack on Britain would be even more catastrophic because we're much more densely populated with suitable targets and people. Indeed, it's estimated that perhaps 30 or even 40 million of us might die. That appalling prospect is the kind of nightmare that's been closely studied by people like Sir Leslie Maver, who's a civil defence specialist from the Home Office, and by Dr. John Dawson, one of the authors of a report published by the BMA called The Medical Effects of Nuclear War. Dr. Dawson, first briefly, do you think that that film accurately describes the aftermath of nuclear war from a medical point of view?
Well, the film of the bomb exploding was, as far as I can tell, a genuine film taken from the United States atmospheric tests in the 50s. You remember a shot there of a house literally exploding. That's known as the 4 PSI house. I'll come back to that in a moment. There's another point about the film, though, which is incorrect. First of all, the drugs would run out much more quickly, I think, than was suggested in the film. And secondly, medically, you'd have to question whether it was worth burying the bodies in a time when you're making very hard choices. I doubt that you would be burying the bodies in that rather neat American way.
Those scenes were very chaotic. There was no medical assistance virtually for the vast bulk of the people who had arrived at the hospital in hope of getting it. Would that be the case in Britain as well?
Yes. If you look at the average nuclear attack that we looked at in the report, we looked at a single bomb, first of all, over a population centre, and that creates, in our view, more casualties than can be coped with in all the acute beds in the National Health Service in England.
Just one bomb would...
Over a population centre would create more casualties than you could look after in the acute beds to the standards that we now think are desirable. When you have a major attack, and that, in our view, would be likely because human nature is that it tends to go on attacking while it can. If you have a major attack, then you get overlapping effects and you get breakdowns in the transport and communications networks that allow the National Health Service to function. And there comes a point quite quickly where the possibility of providing anything other than first aid, and that wouldn't be by a doctor, would be quite remote.
In one word, is that a complete breakdown of the medical services?
It's a breakdown of the medical services as you know them now, yes.
Sir Leslie Maver, in the light of the film and what we've just heard from the BMA, and in the light of what one of the women was saying in the audience there, what are we talking about when we use the term civil defence in this context?
Well, I think that one thing that emerges from that film is that if one were to take it as an actual portrayal of events, one would say that civil defence had been at a very low ebb in that country. There was little evidence, certainly that impressed itself on my mind, of any effective public warning system. And there was very little evidence subsequently in the immediate pre-attack and post-attack phase of people having heeded any instructions as to what they might do to look after themselves.
Under the existing government policy guidelines and the existing level of training, would the circumstances not be very similar to that which we've just seen?
Well, unhappily, to an extent, they might be. You mean in this country, in that people have been remarkably resistant to learning what they might do to help themselves in any form of war emergency. And one mustn't only think of, I would say, that film portrayed all-out nuclear war, but in any war emergency, through the conventional phase, through the use of nuclear weapons, up to that phase, people have been, and certainly local councils, have been remarkably resistant to the idea of accepting responsibility for education of the public and for carrying out certain preparations and making certain plans.
That film is likely to strengthen those councils who are not fulfilling their government duty, as it were.
Would you say so? I would say quite the opposite. I would say that the message of that film is that we must do everything possible to prevent this event ever occurring, which explains...
There is no halfway house. In a period of tension of 2 to 3 weeks, you either go into a war because you've lived on a permanent war footing and you are fully prepared, or else you go in with the stocks that you have in peacetime. You cannot suddenly produce more morphine in 2 to 3 weeks. You can't bleed the population dry to provide blood for blood transfusions. So you will have only the medical supplies and the planning that you have in peacetime.
Gentlemen, we'll stop there. Thank you very much. Back to the audience.
Well, we've got a civil defense volunteer in the audience, Graham Bate. Will you be with us, taking care of us on the day or the day after?
Depends rather the situation, how much warning we get, and what situation my wife and family are. I'll put them first, I'm afraid, initially.
If it comes to the crunch, you'll be in the shelter with them.
I will, yeah.
Well, what about those of us who survive in spite of Mr. Bate? Professor Norman Myers is part of an international working party that's looking at the global consequences of a nuclear war. What can we expect?
Mr. Healy referred to what we might call a nuclear winter, and this, I believe, will cause the ultimate repercussions of nuclear war to be very much worse than are portrayed in that film. A nuclear war would throw up so much dust and smoke into the atmosphere that a dense cloud would be formed, spreading rapidly right around the northern hemisphere and reaching deep into the southern hemisphere. This cloud would be thick enough to shut out all sunlight and all the sun's warmth, and temperatures would plunge to as much as -23 degrees centigrade, That's like the Arctic. As a result of this nuclear winter, most plants will be killed off, including all agricultural crops. When human survivors can eventually emerge from their underground shelters, they'll encounter a landscape in Britain like that of Alaska. There'll be no animals because they'll have starved or frozen, so the survivors will have to, they can't even turn to birds or rats to eat, they'll have to make out of acorns and insects.
Just briefly, are you saying that virtually any nuclear strike spells the end of the species?
Conceivably, yes. That was the bottom line conclusion of an international team of scientists, that it would certainly be the end of Western civilization as we know it. 2 billion dead just from the long-term effects, let alone the immediate battle, could conceivably lead eventually to the extinction of the human species. And that was a carefully considered opinion of an international team of scientists.
Thank you. That sort of nuclear winter was not the sort of nuclear freeze we had in mind. And on that note, back to Robert.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, everyone in the audience, for the time being. After the break, we'll be back to talk about how we can try and avoid that extremely bleak prospect, even bleaker than the film itself, which Professor Myers has just opened up for us. Join us after the break.
Now, Amstrad bring you the latest in VHS video recorders. Beautifully compact and simple to use, with remote control, 14-day timer, fast picture search, and freeze frame. Superb value. So good you'll want to see it on Amstrad's 14-inch color TV, with one of the best pictures in its class, color lock and AFT controls, and 8-station presets. It's the ideal portable for just £169. Or sit back and enjoy. Super wide sound, superb picture quality, infrared remote control, auto color balance, plus a matching video stand. Amstrad's beautifully slim 22-inch TV, around £289, or £369 with teletext. Amstrad, one great idea after another. From Argos, Comet, Co-op, Currys, Dixons, Rumbelows, Woolworth, and Eastern Electricity Board.
If you thought Seiko watches were all science and technology, we'd like to surprise you a little. When we bring you precision in time, we like to do it in style. Julia, over the past few weeks, you've cleared your dandruff with Head & Shoulders, right?
Right.
So, what are you going to use now?
Well, I don't need a dandruff shampoo anymore. So I use this. Right?
Wrong. That's asking for your dandruff back. Try new enriched Head & Shoulders and you need never see your dandruff again. Look, we washed this girl's hair in new Head & Shoulders until the dandruff had cleared. Then on one side, we switched to a beauty shampoo. But on the other, we continued with new Head & Shoulders. 6 weeks later, and look, on this side, the dandruff's back. But on the new Head & Shoulders side, still no dandruff.
I see. New Head & Shoulders. Smells lovely. So rich and creamy. It's really nice.
So to keep your hair looking this good, keep on using Head & Shoulders regularly.
Right.
Ask for new Head & Shoulders, or you could be asking for your dandruff back.
Diamond rings and pearls might suit other girls. I think they may be sham. Gold may always glimmer, stars above may shimmer, but nothing sparkles like a baby sham. Gold may always glimmer, stars above may shimmer, but nothing sparkles like a baby sham.
Welcome back. In the day after, nuclear war appeared to start when NATO responded to the Warsaw Pact invasion of Western Europe by detonating tactical nuclear weapons over the advancing Soviet forces, a scenario that's at least consistent with the NATO policy of flexible response, which involves the readiness to be the first to use nuclear weapons. Admiral Zumwalt, a former member of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff and an advocate of NATO policy, is with us on the satellite from America. Admiral, do you accept the view that were there to be a first use of nuclear weapons in Europe, that it would indeed escalate in the way in which it did in that film?
No, I concede that there is a possibility of it. I believe that the greater probability is that it would not, because I believe the Soviet leadership is every bit as cognizant as are we of the devastating effects of further escalation. I think the key point to remember with regard to NATO policy is that we democracies have over the years permitted ourselves to become markedly inferior to the Soviet Union with regard to conventional military capability. They have the power to overrun Europe at any time, and it is the threat of escalation to tactical nuclear weapons, in my judgment, which has saved Europe these past couple of decades.
But do you believe that once that threat was exercised, once that first nuclear weapon was let off, do you believe that then, are you saying that you think the Soviets would then see sense, as it were, and stop?
I think that the Soviets are quite unlikely to invade Europe as long as they face the threat of first use by NATO of tactical nuclear weapons.
But you do believe, or do you not believe, that there is a role for those nuclear weapons were deterrence to break down? Do you believe nuclear weapons can be used or not?
I believe that it would be a tragic thing if they had to be used. I believe that if the Soviet Union, through some insane miscalculation, invaded NATO with conventional forces and tactical nuclear weapons were used, that the Soviet leadership is sensible enough to avoid further escalation of the type that was apparent in the movie.
Isn't that a precarious assumption to make? Because isn't it as likely that the Soviet Union will say, well, we are going to retaliate to that nuclear attack,
yes,
and so on up the scale? Isn't that one of
yes,
the great problems with the early use of nuclear weapons?
Yes, it is a precarious assumption, but it's even more precarious, in my judgment, to announce that they would not be used and invite the Soviet invasion, which they have the capability to complete successfully, given the general incapability of NATO and unwillingness on the part of NATO democracies to match the Soviet conventionally.
If NATO is prepared to use nuclear weapons first, does that mean that NATO believes it possible, however terrible that war would be, possible to prevail in a nuclear war, to emerge from it successfully?
No, I do not think there are many in NATO who believe that anyone would emerge successfully from a nuclear exchange. But I do believe that there are many who believe sensibly that the threat of escalation, and after all, the Soviets have to calculate not only a decision by the United States government, but also by the British and French, and therefore they have to make a multidimensional calculation. I believe that their concern for the possible use will, as it has in the past, deter them from an invasion.
Admiral, thank you. I hope you'll stay there, because we may come back to you later. But for the moment, let's consider NATO's present policy again, which is to prevent, of course, the day after ever happening. That policy, flexible response, was established 16 years ago when Robert McNamara, the principal architect of that policy, was American Secretary of Defense. Mr. McNamara, who's now in Geneva, can I ask you, do you believe that it is possible that that first nuclear exchange would not escalate in the way in which it did in the film?
I don't know any political or military authority who believes that nuclear war, once started, will remain limited, and all agree that unlimited nuclear war will destroy Western civilization. And as we've learned recently, it is very likely to destroy much of the civilization in the southern hemisphere as well as the northern.
Does that explain why you now advocate a reversal of the first use policy to a no first use policy by NATO?
It does.
Now, what you're saying, if I understand it correctly, is that there is no conceivable military use for nuclear weapons under any circumstances.
I have stated categorically, and I welcome the opportunity to repeat it now, there is no military use whatsoever for nuclear weapons other than to deter one's opponent from the use of nuclear weapons.
There is a NATO reaction to that, which is if you forswear the first use of nuclear weapons, you are in effect saying or declaring that the United States will not come to the rescue of Europe, and therefore Western Europe would become at the mercy of the Soviet Union.
Well, that, as any thinking European will agree, is a false statement. The U.S. has 300,000 troops in Western Europe today. It has supported the defense of Europe for 30 years. It is a grossly unfair allegation that the U.S. will not support the defense of Europe. I well recall the 7 years I spent supporting it. We have security treaties. We have a recognition that our own security depends upon the security of Europe. It's inconceivable to me that we would not come to Europe's defense with all the support and all the strength at our disposal.
If you believe it is so incredible to use nuclear weapons, is the principal danger then the risk that in a crisis one side or another would be driven to use nuclear weapons in order to preempt an attack?
Well, that is a danger, and I think one of the actions that each of the powers and each of the pacts should take is to reduce that risk. But let me say that today, NATO's strategy, its war plans, its weapons development and deployment are all based on the assumption that, as Admiral Zumwalt said a moment ago, it would confront a Soviet conventional attack with early use of nuclear weapons. I believe that's suicide. As Field Marshal Lord Carver has said, he believes it would be criminally irresponsible for NATO to initiate use of nuclear weapons on that basis, because he believes, and I believe, and an increasing number of military and civilian experts are coming to believe, it would result in destruction of Western civilization.
Mr. McNamara, here are you. You were in the highest position advocating this policy once. It now still is the policy. How do you explain, if you now see so clearly that it's suicidal, how do you explain that NATO governments are unequivocally, at the moment, wedded to that policy?
Well, I think Admiral Zumwalt put his finger on the heart of the problem, and that's deterrence. NATO believes, and many political and military leaders in the West believe, that the threat of the first use of nuclear weapons deters Soviet conventional aggression. And I think one would have to say that in years past that has certainly been true. At a time when NATO had a nuclear advantage compared to the Warsaw Pact of something on the order of 10-1, the threat of early use of nuclear weapons by NATO undoubtedly had some deterrent value. Today, when that ratio has been changed dramatically to rough parity, the threat of NATO committing suicide in response to a Soviet conventional aggression, I think, has less deterrent value. And it carries with it the very, very high risk of early use and hence suicide.
You have advocated a series of steps to reduce the risk of nuclear war. I'll mention some of them because we can't go through the entire list, but you have no launch on warning. We should publicly declare that there be no launch on warning. You advocate a nuclear-free zone negotiated with the Russians, that you would reduce by 50% NATO's existing stockpile in Europe. Now, if you take those all over, what is the impact of, in your view, of instituting those changes?
It will greatly reduce the risk of nuclear war. And let me take just 30 seconds, if I may, to say to your audience that we are living in a world with something on the order of 40,000 nuclear warheads, divided roughly equally between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, with a destruction power roughly 1 million times that of the Hiroshima bomb. I strongly favor arms reduction, as I'm sure most in your audience do, but I don't believe the most optimistic of arms negotiators thinks it possible to reduce the existing inventories of warheads by more than, say, 50% over the next 10 to 15 years. That would be miraculous if we did. That means we would then have something in the order of 20,000 nuclear warheads. The fact is that we, our children, and our children's children will be living in a world with tens of thousands of nuclear weapons for decades to come. And my belief is we must, therefore, act to think of how to reduce the risk that those warheads will be used. We've seen tonight, and it is clear that the use of 300 or 400 out of these tens of thousands would destroy civilization. We must act to reduce that risk.
One of the ways, sorry, I'd just like to to move on, if I may,
Yes.
to one particular instance of how you would try to remove that risk.
Yes.
I think a lot of Europeans will find it quite startling and important, and I think I quote you accurately, that you say of the cruise and Pershing missiles that are now being deployed in Europe, that they should stay here, and I quote you, only for as long as it takes to convince the Europeans that those weapons are serving no military purpose. Then they should be withdrawn unilaterally. So what I understand from that is that the NATO position that they are an answer to the SS-20 is, in your view, a military nonsense.
It's absolute nonsense. There was no military requirement for the Soviets to introduce the SS-20s. After they did so, it did not change the nuclear balance between the powers. It changed the numbers in Europe, but it did not change the balance in any way. There was no military requirement for NATO to introduce Pershing IIs and cruise missiles into Europe. I think many, if not most, military and political authorities, both in Western Europe and in the US, would agree with that contention. What is said is that there's a political requirement, as I think you referred to earlier. There's a belief among many in Europe that those weapons are a sign of US determination to support Europe. So long as Europe believes that, and because confidence is a foundation of NATO's strength and unity, I would be willing to see them deployed there. But they tend to destabilize the deterrent situation. And one of the basic principles we must accept in this nuclear world, and on which we must build actions to try to reduce the use of these weapons, one of the basic principles is that each side, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, the US and the Soviet Union, must maintain a stable deterrent. We must have confidence in our ability to stop our opponents from using nuclear weapons. If we act, or our opponents act, in ways that reduce that confidence, that increases the danger of what you referred to as preemptive attack.
In a word,
those Pershing II weapons, if I take just 10 seconds more, those Pershing II weapons are looked upon by the Soviets, I think quite incorrectly, but nonetheless looked upon by the Soviets as destabilizing weapons, because with their short flight time, the Soviets feel they may, to use their term, decapitate their command and control system.
In a word, Mr. McNamara, you're saying that if unilaterally we were to withdraw Cruise and Pershing from Europe, the day after would get further away.
Yes, that is one action, a relatively small and unimportant action, but an action that would reduce the risk of nuclear war, and one, and therefore I'm in favor of, as soon as it can be done without reducing the confidence of the Europeans in U.S. support of the defense of Europe.
Mr. McNamara, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. McNamara is, with his thinking, trying to work towards more safety, still within the present framework of an ultimate nuclear deterrent. But of course, there is a body of opinion which believes that no safety is possible at all, so long as we have any nuclear weapons at all in Britain. Joan Ruddock is the chairperson of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Joan Ruddock, if CND's priority is to get rid of all nuclear weapons from UK soil, that doesn't necessarily mean we won't have a nuclear war, does it? Because there could be one between the two superpowers on the continent.
That's correct. While any states actually have nuclear weapons, and while there is a competition between states that could lead to conflict, then clearly there could be a nuclear war, and any state could actually suffer the effects of that war.
But then are you really as relevant as some of your supporters make out?
Absolutely, because unless we're to accept the inevitability of the nuclear arms race, the way in which it is going on and becoming more and more dangerous with more and more weapons and modern types of weapons with great accuracy, of which McNamara has spoken, then we have to make some move to halt that arms race. And in our country, we have to ask ourselves, have we got any use for nuclear weapons whatsoever in terms of a real defense policy for us? And our answer to that is that we have no use for nuclear weapons, and that by having those nuclear weapons, we actually present targets to other states that have nuclear weapons.
Now, your recent conference, of course, decided to get out of NATO. But you do still, don't you, believe in holding conventional weapons and, if necessary, using them against an alien threat?
I think that you would find that everyone in the peace movement is a patriot. They want to defend this country and our way of life, and there are a variety of ways in which we believe it can be defended. Where we are absolutely united is that, and this was clear from the film, that you cannot use nuclear weapons for defense. And I wonder, because Mr. Heseltine wouldn't debate with me, if you would allow me just to make some reference to the remarks he made. He said that no one could countenance the use of nuclear weapons. The fact is, we do countenance the use. We're part of the NATO alliance, which accepts first use in a conventional conflict. And we do have this brochure from the government about cruise missiles. It says in here quite clearly, the aim of using them would be to persuade the Russian leadership, even at the 11th hour, to draw back. Now, each cruise missile warhead is equivalent to 15 Hiroshimas, and it is suggested that we could actually use those weapons in some way to deter the Soviet Union. That is a nonsense, and nothing Sir Leslie Maver can say about civil defense will protect our people in the circumstances of using those missiles.
Nevertheless, the Soviet Union might still have to be dealt with in some way. You have said that your supporters are patriots, which nobody doubts, or only a few people doubt. But conventional weapons would have to be used then against a Soviet threat, should there be one. This doesn't necessarily save us from nuclear war, does it? Because the Soviet Union might easily think, well, we have this war with Britain with conventional weapons, we'll end it quickly and use our nuclear weapons, knowing perfectly well there'd be no retaliation back. So Britain would still suffer from nuclear fallout and the sort of devastation we saw in that film.
You're suggesting that we accept absolutely that the Soviet Union has some designs on Britain. Now, I am not convinced that that is the case.
But now you're getting a bit into the Michael Heseltine position, because it could be so. Are you saying it could never be so?
No, no, no. I'm not saying it could never be so. I said that you are suggesting that we do accept that it is so. And I am saying there is doubt about that. I do not believe the Soviet Union is seeking to invade this country. What I do believe is that there is an incredible and amazingly dangerous arms race going on between the superpowers, that they are in conflict. We talk about a war occurring in Europe. It might occur in the Middle East. It might occur in Central America. Where then does Britain stand, or any country in Europe, if the superpowers decide to go to war with nuclear weapons? We have to do something about the nuclear arms race. We can't just go on accepting it. Britain can make its position clear and say, we believe that these weapons cannot be useful to us. We can get out of the nuclear weapons business. And I believe if we did that, it would actually have some effect on the whole position of nuclear weapons states.
Thank you, Joan Ruddock. Dr. Owen in London, would you like to take up Joan Ruddock on what she's just been saying?
Well, I think that where Joan Ruddock is first wrong is in saying that you could come out of NATO, because I think that the trigger for this war was that the Soviet forces in the film overwhelmed West German defenses, and that was because the conventional defenses of NATO are not strong enough. The first thing is, if you don't want to risk nuclear war, is you must increase your your conventional defenses in order to avoid nuclear war. The second thing, and I agree with Bob McNamara, is you must take out those battlefield nuclear weapons that are currently sited very close to the east-west German frontier and have a battlefield nuclear weapon-free zone. And the third thing is that NATO must declare that it is not going to have an early use of nuclear weapons strategy, and that you'll pull them back out of the main battlefield area, and you would only use nuclear weapons as a matter of cold calculation, and you would never allow a situation as envisaged in the film, in which political control was given to fire those 3 tactical nuclear weapons, in my view, much too early. Now, I think those are the 3 elements. You've got to stay in NATO and increase your conventional defense. You've got to reduce the threshold of nuclear war, and that means building up your conventional forces. And in my view, you cannot do that either Britain alone or Britain outside as a neutral country. You've got to remain in NATO and reduce the emphasis on the early use of nuclear weapons.
Do you agree with Mr. McNamara when he says that cruise and Pershing missiles are militarily quite useless?
I think they are predominantly a political response to SS-20 deployment. I believe that now you've got 41 missiles. I totally agree with what he said about Pershing. I think they are the weapons that I would never have deployed, and I personally still think we could reach an agreement in which no Pershings are deployed. I think cruise missiles ought to be frozen now at the present number, and I hope that we can get back into negotiations, get the Soviets to reduce their SS-20s, very few cruise. Those that remained in Britain ought to be under British control as well as American control. I think all of this demonstrates that it's quite unreal to believe that we can have missiles launched from Britain that there can be any question whatever could be fired without the absolute authority of the British Prime Minister. And that means RAF personnel be actually involved in the launch mechanism, which is the precedent which was established by Harold Macmillan when the only and last time we had ground-launched missiles in this country, which was Thor missiles in 1958. And I still remain absolutely baffled why the Prime Minister will not accept dual-key control for cruise missiles. Hopefully, you'll negotiate all cruise missiles away and all SS-20s.
Thank you, Dr.
That's very
Owen.
optimistic.
Thank you, Dr. Owen. Mr. Healy, could we hear your response both to Mr. McNamara and Admiral Zumwalt, but also perhaps to Joan Ruddock?
Well, first let me say I agree totally with Bob McNamara. We worked together 20 years ago when we both thought flexible response was a better thing than a tripwire leading to total strategic nuclear exchange. That's how it came about. We both now believe that flexible response is a very, very dangerous policy because some new things have come about. For example, the electromagnetic pulse, which stopped all those motor cars running, stopped the wireless in the film, would stop commanders communicating with their troops and indeed with their own headquarters once a nuclear exchange had begun. And this is why, frankly, I think that the cruise deployment is an idiocy, because the cruise missiles are designed to be fired at communications headquarters inside the Soviet Union. The idea that if we dropped them in Russia, each, as Mrs. Ruddock, has the power of 15 Hiroshimas, and that we could fire 64 off even from Britain, 160, without the Russians immediately retaliating by obliterating us, just needs to be stated to be seen to be nonsense. And I was very glad that Mr. McNamara said that if we came to the conclusion politically it didn't make sense to have them, we should unilaterally send them back, and that is my view. Now, on Mrs. Ruddock's other point, I think that she did concede, quite rightly, that if the Russians and Americans fight one another, then we shall suffer whether we have nuclear weapons or not, whether we're in NATO or not. The really important thing is to get the big powers, first of all, to start talking to one another. Mr. Reagan seems to think he's fighting a holy war against communism. Sometimes the Russians talk as if they were fighting a holy war against capitalism. But we've all got to live together on this planet, and we want both sides to start cutting their armaments. I don't think we shall have any influence on the Western side unless we show we're prepared to play a part in the defense of the West. I want to move NATO's strategy away from depending on nuclear weapons towards conventional defense, and I think Mrs. Ruddock would support that. But I also think that so long as the Soviet Union has an enormous armory of nuclear weapons, NATO somewhere has to have nuclear weapons to deter her from using them. We can never forget that the only time nuclear weapons have ever been used in war, they were used in exactly the scenario which was mentioned a moment ago. They were used by a nuclear power, the United States, against a non-nuclear power, Japan, to accelerate victory.
We've rather lost Joan Ruddock's point that we should have no nuclear weapons whatsoever. Joan Ruddock, would you like to come back to those two?
Well, I think what both the speakers have been talking about is their desire for substantial disarmament to be brought about in the nuclear weapons arena. And of course, the peace movement is very much campaigning for that. The reason that we say that Britain must act independently and not wait to secure a bilateral or a multilateral agreement is because there is no evidence of any multilateral agreement actually removing a single nuclear warhead in the whole history of talks since nuclear weapons were first invented. That is why we say we must act independently, we must rid ourselves of our own nuclear weapons. And the point about NATO is that it is a principled position. NATO at the present time is a nuclear alliance led and dominated by the United States, and as such we do not feel that Britain and Britain's interests are best served by this form of alliance. There may be people who would like to join in some other kind of European defence system, but what we are saying at the present time is we have a policy of first use, we have a movement which we believe is towards a first strike capability by the West, to be followed by the Soviet Union. And that is a development and a policy that can only bring about, I'm afraid, the scenes that we saw in the film.
I'm going to Admiral Zumwalt in America. Admiral, you've heard the anxieties from a number of people, eminent practitioners of the art of defence diplomacy, wishing to change NATO policy. Are you unmoved, however? Do you still believe that NATO policy, as it is now, should prevail?
Now, there's much that has been said with which I agree, and I think there are more similarities than differences in views. The tragedy is that for many years, the United States had the capability to ensure against the invasion of NATO because of three superiorities: our maritime capability to reinforce Europe conventionally, our superiority in strategic central systems, and our superiority in tactical nuclear systems. We have lost all three of those superiorities, and today Western Europe is subject to invasion, and that has not occurred, in my judgment, for the simple reason that the Soviet Union is not able to assure itself that we might not use first nuclear weapons. Now, this is a tragic situation. It's a situation that all of us here, I think, agree needs in some way to be avoided. I would avoid it by first having our political leaders have the courage to admit that we haven't caused enough sacrifices from our public to arm ourselves with conventional weapons to the level that would deter, without nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union. I would join Bob McNamara in agreeing that we could begin to reduce our nuclear weapons, keeping parity with the Soviet Union, but only when we have in some way figured out how to prevent the cheating that the Soviet Union has carried out with regard to most of its agreements.
Admiral, thank you very much. And back to the audience.
Well, you've heard a wide range of views tonight, but after all the talk, where does it leave you? Does anybody at all feel grounds for cautious optimism? How about the lady in the fourth row with the blonde hair and the brown and black striped dress? Any optimism?
I see no cause for optimism at all.
You feel your mind hasn't been changed by any of our speakers?
I think a nuclear war is eventually inevitable.
Right. I wonder whether anybody else feels that they have a better or at least a different formula for salvation than any we've heard tonight. How about Fred Hassan from European Nuclear Disarmament?
I don't think I could present a ready formula for salvation. What worries me from what I've seen tonight is that of all the people we've seen on the screen, our present Defence Minister, Mr. Heseltine, is probably the least credible of them all. And I think we've seen from Mr. McNamara that the stationing of cruise missiles in this country is really a political game of chess that they're playing with the Soviet Union. And then I wonder how Mr. Heseltine can have the cheek to say that that film should be shown in the Soviet Union and that it would have a great effect there. You know, I think he ought to realise that there's a majority of people in this country who don't want these missiles.
And I think I'm going to have to stop you there, because I'm sure we'd hear a different view from some young conservatives that I think we have in the audience. They're a young conservative that wants to put a different point of view. The fellow in the third row there, right.
Well, I think one thing that's not been stressed enough is what the gentleman in America said. The conventional forces of Russia are such that they could overrun Western Europe. And the question is, why aren't they? And the obvious answer to me appears to be that they're being deterred from doing so. And what's deterring them is the nuclear threat. They know as well as we do that nobody can win in a nuclear war. And the only reason why they're not going to invade Western Europe is the deterrence. They have the forces to do it. They've got 2.5 times the number of tanks, 3 times the amount of artillery. What's stopping them? It's their declared aim to spread communism. What's stopping them?
And there, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it for tonight with the comforting thought that at least it hasn't happened yet. And back to Robert.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you indeed all here in Leeds and in London, Geneva, and America. Good night.